Well, I'm going to go ahead and get this webinar started. Welcome to all of you. It's such a pleasure to see you. We're really happy that we're able to put this webinar on. I'm going to start with a little bit of tech stuff before doing some more introductory things. So, as you may have noted just now, we are recording this because we want to make it possible for people to see it later. So if you don't like that, you can, cancel your picture or something. With respect to the chat, I have turned it on in such a way that you can only contact the hosts and co-hosts. That would be me and Luke and Russ Passon. And the reason for that is that we don't want to be disrupting the speakers as they're talking and distracting everyone else with that. But when we get to Q&A, then we'll turn the chat back on. We are also muting everyone as people are coming on the call. And again, that's to prevent unnecessary noise. Later when we have Q&A or at other times you are able to unmute yourself. But those of you who are relatively new to Zoom, and probably there aren't many of you, you should see in the top right corner of your computer, at least this is true on mine, a little box that says view. And if you click on that, then you can choose if you want the gallery view or the speaker view. And I really think that the speaker view is better because in an event like this where people are, where we have main speakers. So you may want to click on the gallery view. So I want to, let's go on to our program now. Start with our program. So my name is Jean Athey. I'm the Executive Director of Maryland Peace Action. And we're the sponsor of this. And I also want to recognize the co-sponsors. Our co-sponsors are Massachusetts Peace Action, New Hampshire Peace Action, Maine Peace Action, also in Maryland, the Democratic Socialists of America of Prince George's County. And then in addition, the Baltimore Yearly Meeting Peace and Social Concerns Committee, which is a Quaker organization. So we're really grateful to all of our co-sponsors who have helped us to get a large turnout for this. If you live in Maryland in particular, we hope that you will join us and become part of the peace movement. We have a very active affiliate now, and we urge you to check out our website at peaceactionmdformaryland.org, and you can find information about us there and how to join us. We really need your help and hope you will decide to do that. I want to also mention my colleague, Luke Mayhew, who has helped to organize this webinar. And among other things, Luke is in charge of tech tonight. So please feel free to send him a chat message if you're having any kind of tech problem. So our webinar tonight is about our longest war, 20 years we've been in Afghanistan. And why? Some of us think it was for revenge, for retribution. Theoretically, it was to protect Americans from Al-Qaeda, but is this really why we went to war in Afghanistan and stayed there for 20 years? What has the war actually been about, and what are its results? What can we learn from our experience there? How has the war affected the people of Afghanistan? And what can we say about the process for getting out of Afghanistan? And finally, and importantly, what can we expect will come next for the people of Afghanistan? We have two really terrific, amazing speakers tonight who can help us shed some light on these questions, and it's my great pleasure to introduce them to you. Each of them will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. My good friend Fahima Gaheez grew up in Afghanistan, and from an early age, Fahima was involved with the women's rights movement there. After immigrating to the US, she continued her work for the people of Afghanistan from afar. In 2001, she founded the Afghan Women's Fund, which was eventually incorporated as an independent charity in 2011. And Fahima continues today as its president. She tries to raise money to support schools for girls, cooperatives for women, clinics in rural areas, and more. Many members of Fahima's family still live in Afghanistan, and she travels there often to oversee the work of the foundation. And while she's there, she talks to people on the ground, the average people, about their beliefs, their feelings, what's happening with them. I hope that you will check out the wonderful work of the Afghan Women's Fund on their website, which is afghanwomensfund.org. Our second speaker is Matthew Hoh. Matthew is a retired military officer and also a US foreign policy strategist. In 2009, he resigned a diplomatic post in protest of the policies in the US approach to Afghanistan and in the war. He was particularly upset about a surge in US troop deployments that Obama implemented. Matt has served in a number of capacities and with several organizations, all advocating for change in US strategy in Afghanistan. He's currently a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and he's the former director of the Afghanistan Study Group. He's worked at the Pentagon and also at the State Department. Matt's letter of resignation from the State Department was front page news, for which he subsequently won the Ridenhour Truth-Telling Prize. So once again, I'm just absolutely thrilled that we have these two wonderful advocates and speakers tonight. Fahima's going to speak first, followed by Matt. So Fahima, it's all yours. You need to unmute. Fahima, can you unmute?
I'm trying, Jean. I told you that it makes me nervous, the computer and everything. I'd rather go and talk in front of people than in the computer. Well, thank you very much, Jean, and thank you, Luke and Matt, for participating. And I really appreciate the audience. And I know some who are old friends, and I have worked with them for a long time. Although I'm now not in Maryland, but I will be coming back to Maryland. In the United States, many people think that the US involvement in Afghanistan started with 9/11 or right after 9/11, but that is not true. The US involvement in Afghanistan started way before 9/11, more than 40 years ago, actually. It started with some of the reform that the then Afghan government brought, and some fundamentalists, the thugs and thieves, left Afghanistan, went to Pakistan, and the US was not very happy about some of the improvements, some of the changes that the government then brought, like nationalizing the banks. And so the US, with the help of Saudi Arabia and with the help of Pakistan, helped these and supported the fundamentalists who were called Mujahideen, called them their friends. And so if you ever come across Brzezinski's book about Afghanistan, and that's the great a chess game. You can read there that the support for the anti-Afghan government started there. Actually, the foundation for the war against the Soviet Union was laid then, way before the Soviet invaded Afghanistan. In 1978, when PDP, the People's Democratic Party, or there were a leftist party, they came to power, they brought even more reform, like land reform or social justice and women's rights, and helping peasant and poor, and that even angered more warlords and the landowners, and more of them went to Pakistan, more of them were trained, and more of them took weapons against the Afghan government. So the interference in the attack on the Afghan territory was so much. I just want to make it very short because the time is short. That the attacks on Afghan territory from Pakistan with the support of the US and the Soviet Union, Saudi Arabia, in other Gulf countries was so much that the Afghan government then asked the Soviet Union to support and help them, Afghanistan. So that is why in 1979, Soviet Union interfered in Afghanistan, and actually, it's also called direct invasion of Afghanistan. So after that, it was a very good excuse for the US to support the Mujahideen openly. Not only the US, of course, other regional power in the Gulf and in NATO and Western countries, they all decided to support the Mujahideen. And Afghanistan became a battlefield between the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, and also the regional power. I don't know if you have seen the video that Hillary Clinton's confession that said that the US supported those fundamentalists against the Soviet Union, talking about the terrorists who are in Afghanistan. Now they're called terrorists now. Of course, at that time, they were not called terrorists. So after the Soviet Union, for 10 years, the war against the Soviet Union, finally in 1989, the Soviet withdrew from Afghanistan. Once they withdrew, everybody else who supported the fundamentalists in Afghanistan and created this chaos, they also left. They also withdrew from there. And that created a big vacuum, and left Afghanistan, neglected Afghanistan, left it in the hand of a bunch of criminal and fundamentalists who were called Mujahideen. But really and truly, they were called by the people of Afghanistan Ashrar, which is the word for terrorist. So the civil war broke down in Afghanistan. Tens of thousands of people were killed, and the country became, they turned the country to a rubble. And from that group, another group came to power, which was the Taliban. Actually, the Taliban were the second generation of the Mujahideen. So when the Taliban came to power, the same thing. And of course, they made the situation even worse for the people, and especially for the women of Afghanistan, human rights, women's rights, and everything that was the life's, today's life standard, that was stepped on. And they took Afghanistan to 7th century. Afghanistan went to 100 years back, and they just destroyed even more. But then 9/11 happened. After 9/11, US and 42 more countries went back to Afghanistan. There was at one point that they had 150,000 or so military personnel in Afghanistan. And that created a lot of confusion, because the US and the US allies in NATO, they paid attention to the wrong people, to the very people who destroyed Afghanistan, to the very people who caused the civil war, to the very people who stepped on every rights of human and women. So, but they did not bring peace to Afghanistan, although actually they made it even worse. When US invaded Afghanistan right after 9/11 in 2001, there was a big brouhaha about the women's rights and human rights and war on terror and those slogans. But they put the violators of human rights and women's rights in power. So those who for decades supported the violence in Afghanistan, they came to power there. And of course, US installed them there. The messages that the NATO and the US were sending to Afghanistan, they were mixed messages. They were very confusing messages. On one hand, they're talking about human rights and women's rights. On the other, in international law and order and so. On the other hand, they put the people who did not believe in any of those issues to power. And of course, many of them became very rich. While the US were hunting for the Taliban and calling the Taliban terrorists, they were bombing innocent villages. They were dropping bombs indiscriminately, irresponsibly on innocent people in search for terrorists. But at the same time, they were with the leaders of the Taliban. They were sitting and having dinner and meeting, for years and years. The bombs which were dropped on innocent poor people, the people who lived in, and that their income was less than $2 a day. They were the breadwinner of the family. Once somebody was killed, once they were killed in the village, of course, what do people do there? Their family, their relatives, they are pushed to the Taliban, despite them not liking the Taliban, but they were pushed to the Taliban. They were afraid of the US bombing. They were angry at the US bombing, but they were also afraid of the Taliban, although they did not trust the US, but they did not like the Taliban either. But at least, they were there because in their villages, they could be, they could have some safety there. Billions and billions of dollars went to the military operation, but not much attention was paid in other areas of life in Afghanistan, like education, healthcare, useful constructions, roads, and on and on. Not much attention was paid to that. Jim Wallace, he wrote in his book, God's Politics, he said, let's deny them the victory. He means deny the terrorists the victory by giving them education, by giving them healthcare, roads, and job, and security, and so. But instead of that, the US and the NATO just bombed the country. They supported the fundamentalists. Instead of that, the poverty got even worse, and the anger at the US and at the bombing and at the Taliban got even worse than before. So that is what the chaos never stopped in Afghanistan. The US being in Afghanistan, the very powerful country, the richest country in the world, to fight the Taliban, to not win the war against the Taliban, it is really ridiculous, because somebody did not want to bring peace to Afghanistan. 20 years of war in Afghanistan still did not bring peace. Fighting the medieval Taliban who did not have much education. They don't have, they don't make the weapons there, where they don't have enough knowledge about the political settlement. They don't have any information about the new world, but they still cannot defeat, the US still cannot defeat the Taliban. This is really something that the intention was not there. And I tell you why the intention was not there. The intention was not there because Afghanistan is a battlefield. Afghanistan is where there is China, which is another superpower, and of course India, which is a superpower, and there is old enemy Russia, and there is Iran. Of course, US did not want to bring peace there because wanted to be there and wanted to stop the China and Russia and those other countries from going further there. So it is a war that was forced on Afghanistan. And it's not just, of course, the US, is like I said, there's regional power and global power. They all are fighting in Afghanistan. The humanitarian aid and, of course, economical aid in the reconstruction support was very little received by the Afghan people. And whatever support that they're giving to the military, or they are giving to the warlord to keep the interest of the US there. Now that the US wants to withdraw from Afghanistan, and suddenly they say that they want to withdraw. Before the withdrawal, I want to talk a little bit about the peace agreement between the Taliban and the United States. If you remember, in 2019, they were about to sign an agreement, and then Mr. Trump decided not to. And then it went back to 2020. In February of 2020, they signed an agreement with the Taliban. They undermined the Afghan government. They undermined the Afghan people, and especially the women of Afghanistan. The agreement was signed with the Taliban, so-called peace agreement. But since the agreement, 6,000 Taliban terrorists who were killers, who were criminals, they were, the US forced Afghan government to release them. Once they were released, the violence escalated. And you probably hear, like almost every day, people are being killed in school and colleges and universities and mosques and buses and cars, and the suicide bombing, or just rocket attack, and so on and on. And in average, over 100 Afghans get killed every day by the violence. So what is going on in Afghanistan, it is forced by others in Afghanistan on Afghans. It is not Afghan war. It is the war that is forced by others in Afghanistan. And we know that the Taliban and other Daesh and other terrorist groups, they all have sanctuary in Pakistan. While the US can impose sanction on Iran because Iran wants to develop nuclear power, and they can impose sanction on North Korea because they have nuclear power. Why can't they impose sanction on Pakistan to stop the support for the Taliban and other terrorist groups in Pakistan? Because according to the US, according to the administration, the Pentagon, many Senate members, Pakistan has thousands and thousands of religious madrasas and thousands of training camps for the fundamentalists, for the terrorists. So why not?
Excuse me, but you're running out of time. But we want to hear your views about what's going to happen next and women. But just 3-4 minutes.
I'm just going to well, okay. The Afghan Human Rights Organization head, Ms. Akbar, said, that's frustrating to watch. We are being left with a huge mess. We are being told to deal with it mostly on our own. It's our country, yes, but it's not a mess we created on our own. And we did not create this mess on our own. While US is withdrawing, it is irresponsible withdrawing to leave us in the hand of Taliban and fundamentalists. They should have, if, like I said before, if they wanted to bring peace, they can do it in 24 hours, because Taliban are they are nothing. They are just the stooges of Pakistan and other countries who are bringing war to Afghanistan. They could have done that. 4 decades of bloodshed, that is more than enough. More than enough suffering that the Afghan people endured. And we should stop this war, but we should bring peace and withdraw responsibility, not leave Afghanistan in the hand of the Taliban and fundamentalists and warlords. So do I have a little more time or no?
2 minutes. And can you talk a little bit about women?
Yes. And, like I said earlier, when US went to Afghanistan, one of the reasons they said that we will bring women's rights to Afghanistan, but that did not happen. And now we are leaving Afghanistan in the hand of those people who step on every women's rights when they were in power, and they still do that. I don't know if you see the videos of the Taliban beating up women and stoning them to death, and in many areas that they have control, women cannot even go to school. So that is what the situation will be if the Taliban come to power. Even that today that the US is there, the US is present there, and the Afghan government tries very hard, that still women's situation did not change very much, not tremendously. Women still don't have, of course they don't have equal rights, but they still don't have enough human rights there to live. They still live in fear. There's still forced marriages. There's still sexual abuse. There's still physical abuse there. And the law in Afghanistan does not protect them. So to leave Afghanistan in the hand of a few fundamentalists who are the violators of human rights and women's rights, that is appalling. That is very irresponsible. So,
thank you very much, Fahima. Matt, would you like to say?
Yeah. Thanks, Jean, and thanks, Luke and Russ and Maryland Peace Action for putting us on, as well as to the folks in Maine and New Hampshire and Massachusetts and everyone else who co-sponsored, and then everyone who's attended. And I'm so pleased to go after Fahima. Fahima, that was absolutely terrific. It's not very often I hear, and I do this a lot, I hear such a well-rounded explanation that contains the depth that you brought in your comments just now, as well as to something that avoids the binary A or B, right? That either you're for the US or you're for the Taliban, you're for, I mean, like there's so much of that discussion in that type of discussion, just that, it's very Manichaean. But at the same time, it's also very simple, right? Which is an extension, I think, of our own culture, right? In our own media, and the way our narrative always has to be A versus B, one or the other. And so I think we've seen that in the last 20 years, with the conversation about Afghanistan, let alone the previous 20 some odd years, which have largely been absent from the American memory, certainly the media's memory. If you look at most of the major media in the United States, the war in Afghanistan starts on September 11th, 2001. Everything that comes before it is just doesn't matter, is of no consequence. And I think that's what I want to focus my comments on, is the continuity of all this. Why is this important? How does this tie in? And how is Afghanistan, while what's happening in Afghanistan is very unique to the Afghans, and the suffering is very, unique to them, just as the sufferings happen in Iraq or Yemen or Libya or Mali or any other place, Pakistan is unique to them. It's all tied into a larger world war, where the one controlling and overwhelming element is the United States. In some places, in many places, there are now just proxies. So the French are proxies for us in Mali, or the Saudis are proxies for us in Yemen. But if you follow the chain back, if you go up the ladder, at the top of all that is the United States. And it's important because the continuity means that what we're going to see happen has already happened in a lot of ways. And what we saw happen with Afghanistan has happened in other countries. If folks haven't read this, and maybe you read it 14 years ago, but Seymour Hersh's article, The Redirection, in the New Yorker, in that article, Hersh talks about how the United States is already beginning plans and beginning the initial operations for the overthrow of the Syrian government, right? And what did we see happen a couple of years after, 3 or 4 years after Hersh wrote that article? You saw the Syrian civil war. You saw the massive bloodshed there, the incredible suffering, the refugees, very similar to what we saw happen in Afghanistan. And in fact, if you read Hersh's piece, Afghanistan is mentioned as a template. So is Iran-Contra for how things were done. We got to do it, in terms of lessons learned by the U.S. government, how to run these secret wars. And so what you really see, whereas Afghanistan, as Fahima says, you go back to 1978, and it's interesting, the same explanation for the Afghan war that I brought up, that Fahima explained, which again is documented in things like Brzezinski's book, Robert Gates, the former CIA director and Pentagon chief. He says the same thing in his memoirs about how the United States tried to bait the Soviet Union in, basically use Afghanistan as a trap, right, for the Soviet Union. I got told by Carlotta Gall of the New York Times that I was a conspiracy theorist for saying something like that. I mean, so not only is it just that people don't want to link these events into it, they are absolutely ignorant in a lot of ways of these things. Carlotta Gall, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist for the New York Times, covered Afghanistan for like 10 years, had no idea about what happened in Afghanistan prior to December 25th, 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded. No idea. For her, that's when history started. And we see that often. And so what's interesting for me with Afghanistan is that while we have a continuity of history, right, that you can look and you can literally trace what the United States has done in Afghanistan and how it's done it, particularly say its divide and conquer strategy, right, where we're going to pit one group against another. We're going to pit one ethnicity against another ethnicity, one geography against another geography. We're going to pit the people in the cities versus people in the rural areas, et cetera, et cetera. You can trace that back all through American warfare, all through all the various American occupations, all through the various American invasions and coups and regime change and everything else. You go all the way back to before this nation was founded, even in the sense that was a strategy that was used against the Native Americans. Along with this continuity comes evolution. So what's interesting to me is that Afghanistan very much is a living legacy of the Cold War, right? The reasons for it was nothing to do with Afghanistan, had everything to do with the Soviet Union. And it's interesting, if you go and you read, I encourage people to go to the National Security Archives at George Washington University and read about what the Soviet Union was saying in 1978, 1979, prior to invading. It's got nothing to do with Afghanistan, everything to do with the United States. Right. I mean, it's the insanity of it. And even more so, if you go back and look at what the British were saying in the 19th century, the reasons why they invaded Afghanistan 3 times had nothing to do with Afghanistan, everything to do with Russia. And those invasions by the British always to defend India from a Russian advance through Afghanistan, after the Soviet Union fell, and historians got into all the Tsarist records and everything, no evidence whatsoever, ever, that the Russians were ever planning on invading Afghanistan, right? So, I mean, not only do you have this semblance of continuity, but you have a semblance of the mendacity, right? The lying that goes behind all that, that enables this. But also too, so along with the continuity and the mendacity, and also too, if people aren't aware, Donald Rumsfeld died today. So that's certainly a key word to tag into with mendacity, Rumsfeld. Although if you read the Washington Post obituary of him, there's not one mention in the Post obituary about the lies of the Iraq War, about Guantanamo Bay, about torture, about the drone program, about the mass surveillance of American citizens, which is a function of the Department of Defense because the NSA is a DoD organization, all of which began under Rumsfeld, all of which occurred under Rumsfeld. No mention of how the invasion of Iraq shattered, murdered 1 million Iraqi lives. In the Post obituary, very much, very balanced, as I like to say. But with the continuity, with the mendacity, also comes evolution. So you see the evolving nature of the American presence, of the way the American empire wants to maintain its possessions, wants to maintain its inequality. Because for me, this is a lot of what it comes down to, is preserving Western inequality over the rest of the world, preserving the Western extraction of wealth from the rest of the world. That's the purpose being in Afghanistan. That's the purpose being in Iraq. That's the purpose being in Africa, throughout the Pacific, et cetera. So with this evolution, though, and this is why I say it's interesting that with Afghanistan, because Afghanistan was one of the first of these, was a legacy of the Cold War, was the first post-Cold War colonial project, really, at least in terms of it's still standing that way. But now it is starting to transition to the way the United States wages its other wars. And so you look at the way the United States is now leaving its forces in Afghanistan. And the news today says that the United States will have its forces out of Afghanistan by the 4th of July, which means acknowledged forces. It has nothing to do with the CIA, the special operations, or the contractors that are there. What you're now going to have happen in Afghanistan, which is occurring in most of the rest of the Muslim world, basically, again, from the west of Africa, the Atlantic coast of Africa, all the way to Pakistan, you have a secret war that is not secret just in the sense that no one's talking about it, or very few investigative journalists are looking at it, or people, the government's not saying anything, or reporters are not asking questions. It's secret because by law, it's secret. When you run these wars where your entire war is conducted by personnel and equipment that by US law are covert, are classified, it's a secret war. I mean, this is a much greater secret war than Nixon and Kissinger's secret wars were in Laos and Cambodia. I mean, those were secret wars, but they were secret wars because they were lying about them, right? But there was nothing classified about the B-52 strikes. There was nothing classified per se about the US troop movements into those countries. They were maybe classified because they were operational, but they weren't classified by nature of their own origination, right? Of their own presence. So what you have is, by US law, CIA operations are classified. By US law, special operations actions are classified. And by US law, drone operations and anything dealing with a drone is classified. So you can have an entire war being and it is happening, right? You have these entire wars occurring all throughout the Muslim world that the US government not only has no responsibility to ever comment on, by law, it would be illegal for government spokespeople to comment on these wars. So that's where I think we're going to with regards to what we're seeing in Afghanistan. And, it's becoming more in line with the wars in terms of the American in terms of the American role of it being a true proxy war, where the people who are on the ground who are doing most of the fighting are those proxy forces that are in our pay, that have come to our side because of a divide and conquer strategy. They're supplemented by American commandos and American CIA personnel who assist at times, who train, and then they're supported by firepower via manned and increasingly unmanned aircraft. One of the things that's really important to notice is that one of the things interesting about the drone program is that up until it goes into operation, it's not classified. So just a few weeks ago, the Navy had its first successful refueling of its drone air tanker off of a carrier, right? So the Navy is going to have these drones that are their refueling tankers. That first successful mission of one, because it was a test, not classified. As soon as it though becomes an actual real mission, like a real operation where it goes out and refuels some F-18s or some other drones or something like that, that whole thing is classified now. Those F-18 pilots who are just flying around someplace like off the coast of California or whatever, doing what, whatnot, just getting their time in behind the stick. That's now a classified mission, even though all they did was fly laps around the Pacific for a little while, right? Just to get their flight time in. So, you have this, where it's going is so insidious and so nefarious. And of course, to tack on then to what Fahima was saying, I'm so glad I'm following Fahima because, she so well explained what's happening in Afghanistan. The suffering of the Afghan people not only continues, but now it's a secret. It's a true government secret. And one of the things you have to understand, and again, I'll get back just to give you an idea. I'm sorry. Oh, I thought someone said something. One of the things just to understand where the American, where this goes is that with this drone tanker, this literally means you have an aircraft carrier somewhere in the possibly even in the Mediterranean, but more likely the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean. It sends out these drone takers. They fly all the way to Afghanistan, refuel drones that are flying over Afghanistan that basically never leave Afghanistan. So whereas you have now American aircraft that fly over Afghanistan, fly over Syria, fly over Niger, wherever, the pilots can only last so long in those aircraft. You now have drones that can be resupplied by aerial drones, right? That basically mean we have a continuance present there that is classified at secret. The CIA and JSOC people there, classified and secret. And as Fahima was explaining, all this suffering of the Afghan people continue to go on because, the peace process has been an absolute sham. It was just a stunt by Donald Trump. This is a peace process that should have began. And again, there's continuity in this. People talk about how in Afghanistan, the United States walked away from Afghanistan after the Soviet Union left. That's absolutely not true. 3 years after the Soviet Union left, the United States and Saudi Arabia were still spending almost $500 million a year on the Mujahideen. Right? I mean, so again, you've got to understand too, the continuity of all that, how, if you want to know what's going to happen in Afghanistan, we're going to still keep backing warlords. We're still going to keep backing drug lords. We're going to have all our CIA and JSOC and drones. And as Fahima said, unfortunately, the suffering is going to continue. And I will wrap it up there. I think I probably went on way too long.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matt. I think both of these were just absolutely brilliant presentations. What we had decided to do when we talked about this webinar was to give, after each of our speakers talk, to give the other speaker a chance to just respond for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll go to Q&A. So Fahima, do you want to say anything more, especially about what Matt said?
Well, actually, what Matt said, that is very correct. The drones, that is really appalling because, and it's easy for them because somebody is operating it either from Northern Virginia or from somewhere. Here, they don't have to be there on the ground, and the US can say that, oh, we are not there. Our troops are not there. Our troops are not on the ground. We are not fighting. So that is really, the war has not stopped. And when they say that we will stop the longest war, they are not stopping the longest war. Another thing that is happening, Matt can also attest to that there are thousands and thousands of contractors there in Afghanistan. And as we know, they're like mercenaries. They're like a semi-militia. They are using weapons, and they are allowed to use weapons, the contractors. And, yes, they are not like in part of the official Pentagon soldiers, but they are part of the U.S. government contractor who are semi, military people. And, it is, if they have, in one report that I read, it's like about 25,000 contractors there. So the U.S. has not left Afghanistan. The U.S. is not leaving Afghanistan. So Matt can probably also talk about that. So.
Okay, Matt, do you have any final words?
Yeah, with regards to the contractors, yeah, it's another unaccountable entity. I mean, I think most people saw recently the U.S. court that ruled that Nestle is not accountable for its slave labor overseas. I mean, the same thing occurs with these contractors in war zones. It's interesting too, because again, you had Donald Rumsfeld die today. And as I said, I'm all upset. I shouldn't have read that post obituary. What did I expect? Right. But I read it. There's no accountability for him at all in that. Mike Gravel, who died this past Sunday, Senator Mike Gravel, who last person I really know in Congress who tried to get any form of accountability by reading the Pentagon Papers into the congressional record. How much attention did he get? How much, and people are going to ask, people have already asked me why. It's the first thing I thought of. Why did a man like Robert McNamara make a mea culpa? Why did McNamara at the end of his life make a confession, say we were wrong? I think it had a lot to do with the actual pressure on him, the moral pressure on him. So if you're a man like Rumsfeld and you know that your obituary is not going to say anything about the murder of 1 million Iraqis, the murder of millions of others, the displacement, the torture, on and on and on, what impetus is there to change? The one thing I do have in my notes, want to make sure I got out, was just so people understand how the suffering in Afghanistan, just a few statistics. 68% of Afghans live on $1 a day. 1 in 3 Afghan households is struggling with some form of drug abuse. So someone in a family, and of course, extended family and everything, but 1 in 3 is what the latest statistics are. And then everyone is familiar where every year there's I forget what the organization that does it, but it names the happiest country in the year in the world, right? And Denmark has got the happiest people, or Iceland or someplace. Afghanistan is continually the saddest country in the year, based upon survey, based upon feedback from the people, in the sense of just how unjust, difficult, and horrible the lives are. And I'll end it by saying, anytime you see anything about the number of casualties in Afghanistan, how many Afghan civilians are, just know that is the bare minimum, most conservative number possible. I saw someone say the other day that 47,000 Afghans were killed since 2001. And I mean, that's just absurd. Just the scale of the fighting, the various factors about Afghanistan, the rural areas, how the dead are buried, and nobody trusts the government. So why are you going to go tell the government that the people are all kinds of things like that, as well as too, what I saw, one of the, things, a great shame I carry with is our killing of civilians. And we only reported, I don't know, in the U.S. military, 1 out of every 5, 1 out of every 6 times we killed civilians probably got reported. So that just, as people, as Afghanistan stays in the news and you hear these numbers, realize that these are very, very low conservative estimates. The true number is, you're talking about over the course of 40 years, millions killed.
Okay, thank you so much, Matt, and thank you so much, Fahima.
Can I add just one thing?
Oh, sure.
While everybody's talking about peace, everybody talks about, we'll bring peace to Afghanistan, but nobody really thinks about the interest of the Afghan people. Everybody just think about their own interest. If it's the regional power, if it's the US and the Pakistan and Saudis, they all think about their own interest. Nobody think about the interest of those poor people who went through 40 years of war for somebody else's interest. Isn't that time for them to at least give these people a breathing room and not just be so selfish to think about their own interest there. Thank you.
Thank you, Fahima. So this is how we're going to do the Q&A. You can put your questions in chat, and I'm going to choose a couple and ask Fahima and Matt to respond, maybe one apiece, and then we'll try a couple of different questions. So one question is, the US government claims that it's going to remove military forces from Afghanistan, but I read that the war has been privatized under Eric Prince and his mercenaries. So I'd like for you to talk a little about that. And let's see. One question also has to do with what has changed this year in the quantity of opium or heroin being sold from Afghanistan. And then a final question, what would be the best for Afghanistan going forward? But I want to say, as we're starting these questions, that we had hoped to end at 8:30, and I'm thinking that maybe we can continue for maybe another 5 or 10 minutes after that, if Matt and Fahima are willing to do that. But anyway, so could each of you respond to at least one of these questions that I've just posed?
Let me just say that about the Eric Prince thing. They were talking about it, but there's so much secrecy in U.S. Military presence in Afghanistan, and they don't even share anything with the Afghan government. They don't share anything with the Afghan people. If you remember, even the peace talk with the Taliban, there was so many secrecy there that they undermined the Afghan government. They would not even share things with them. There is nothing confirmed, but as I said earlier, there are 25 or so thousand mercenaries there, which they're like the contractor, private armies. And so, and maybe there are more that we don't know, but that is something that I read in the report. There were talk about it. There was a big brouhaha about it, that Eric Prince wanted to privatize the war there. So that's what I know.
Yeah, with regard to the privatization of the war, is very interesting, because Jim Mattis, when he was Secretary of Defense, was supposedly the guy who shut that down because he wanted to keep the war within the military and within the US government. These generals don't want to lose their part of the empire, right? They don't want to lose their reason for being. They don't want to see these contractors cut in on their turf, so to speak, right? So, but one of the things that we're not sure about what's going to happen with the contractors is who is going to pay them. They're only going to be there if they get paid. So what happened in Iraq when the United States forces left, the Iraqi government didn't have the money right away to pay for the contractors. So if you're going and look at the reports on contractor presence in Iraq that the Congressional Research Service puts out, you'll see that contractor presence in Iraq in 2011, 2012 totally bottoms out. But then it starts to rise back up, because what happens is the Iraqis start paying for contractors. The US government then starts shifting money from the US government to the Iraqis to allow them to pay. So who's going to pay for the contractors is something I don't think that's been really worked out yet.
But we don't know.
Well, we don't know. And certainly I would imagine that the contractors are in Congress every day lobbying for the US government provide funds to Afghanistan to pay for these contractors. So the US government gives the money to Afghanistan, and the Afghanistan uses that money to purchase the contractors. That's what happens a lot of times. That's what a lot of this, when you see US military assistance, the billions and billions we give around the world every year, a lot of that money goes to services and contractors. It's a racket, right? With regards to this is a good segue into the opium. Continually, unless there's a drought or a blight or some other act of God, the opium production has increased every year since 2001. And we don't, I mean, I could go on for this all night. It's something I saw, and I was interviewed by Mint Press this past weekend. If you guys look up Mint Press News, Alan McLeod was a journalist. How the CIA built the opium trade in Afghanistan or something like that's the title, goes into a lot more. But the U.S. has been complicit with the drug lords there in Afghanistan since the 1980s. We're the ones who brought the drug into Afghanistan to help, again, continuity. This is what the French did in Indochina. This is what the U.S. did after, this is what the U.S. did with the Contras in Nicaragua. This is what the British, of course, did with China. But the U.S. brought opium into Afghanistan as an export product. Up until that point, the Afghans didn't produce enough really to export. So the CIA brings it in the 80s to help fund the war. You know, I mean, so that's, it doesn't just start on 2001. This has real history to it, right? But anyway, the one thought I want people to think about is the connection between the growth in poppy production that produces the illegal opiates in Afghanistan, where Afghanistan goes from single digit percentage of world production of illegal opiates in 2001 to between 80 and 90% over the last decade at least, with the major drug lords in Afghanistan all being in the Afghan government, all being in the Afghan military, you know, the brother of President Karzai, et cetera, right? Along with the opioid crisis, the explosion in heroin use, et cetera, that we've seen here in the United States and throughout Europe, Russia, et cetera. I mean, you've had 70, 80,000 people dying a year by opioid overdose in the United States over the last 10, 15 years. And there's a connection there to the Afghan war. I'm not saying that US troops are loading up opium onto transport planes, but we're giving transport planes to drug lords in Afghanistan. I mean, it's something that, you know, so this is how war affects the United States, whether we really realize it or not.
The WHO wanted to donate some grain wheat to poor women, mostly to the widows. And they brought they did not want to buy it from the Afghan farmers. They bought the grain from Central Asia and from other countries. They imported them and they donated them. And I asked that question, why not the grain from Afghanistan? Say that that's what their policy is. They don't want to buy grain from the farmers. Okay, if the farmers cannot sell their grains, what would they do? Of course, they will go to drugs. That was planned. That was designed that way for them to go and do the drugs instead of growing wheat.
Here are a couple of other questions. One person says that that he read a book by Ann Jacobson that mentions that we spent millions of dollars on biometrically identifying people with things like fingerprints, scans, DNA samples, and so forth. Could you comment on this? And then another question, would you be able to talk about potential mineral production of metals like gold and lithium? Is that important in what we're doing in Afghanistan?
Are you asking me?
Either one of you.
Yeah, I can talk about the biometrics. I mean, I saw that, and that's a program that begins in Iraq that we get from the Israelis. It's under the whole guise of population control, and you basically fingerprint and iris scan everyone you can. The idea being that if somebody makes a bomb, this is the purported idea, right? This is the reason that they give. The idea being if someone makes a bomb, and we recover the bomb pieces, then we can forensically identify them, because now we've set up checkpoints all throughout the country. So the guy who made the bomb is driving his car. He pulls up to a checkpoint. He's got to get his fingerprints scanned. Voila, it's in the database. You take him off to, you take him off to prison. That the reality was, it was about population control. It was about making sure, putting fear into the people, making people realize that they are being tracked by technology, that we are a power much greater than they are. We are almost supernatural, as well as is trampling on their rights. But, and I'm sure Fahima can comment on this much better than I can. It made more enemies, just for the simple fact that you're dealing with, particularly in Afghanistan, but the same was in Iraq, you're dealing with very rural, conservative, religious, parochial families and villages. I remember I met a man one time who claimed his province was the second province to revolt against the government in 1978. And I said, what caused you guys to revolt? And he said, because the government came to our village and asked us what our wives' names were. Right. I mean, so very much this, well, how true that was, I don't know. But that idea that there's this invasion of the traditional invasion, and, by doing this, by fingerprinting and iris scanning everybody, men, women, children, we were humiliating them. We were subjugating them. We were trying to control them. And it was, I will say that the finding the bombers did work. It did work at times until they figured out what they were doing. And then they just stopped driving on the roads we had checkpoints on. But that was the purpose behind the biometrics.
So fighting the illegal bombing, but there are bombs made in here by the government and by the big companies, and nobody can fingerprint them. So.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely.
What was the other question?
Was somebody wanted you to comment on metals like gold and lithium? And also, would one of you be able to comment on the proposed TAPI pipeline that would run from Turkmenistan to India?
The Afghanistan, I always say that it's the richest, poorest country in the world. Afghanistan, just in one belt of Afghanistan, it's like about $3 trillion worth of minerals. But of course, they are untapped. So the Chinese started copper there in Logar, but then the war started, and of course, the US and the US allies do not want Chinese to be there. So that is stopped. So not much work is done on mineral right now, but I read news that they are talking about it. I mean, just in the preliminary work right now. The TAPI, I just read it yesterday. Actually, they are going to restart that again. The work stopped because of the violence and because of the war and so. But I just read it yesterday. They are going to start it. I don't know what does that mean. They're going to start it, and that means that the war will stop. That they are going to start it. But yes, it will go if it works out. It will go all the way to Pakistan and to India. So TAPI is still the project that they want to work on, but they suddenly they stopped it a couple of years ago.
Thank you so much. So Luke has put the website for the Afghan Women's Fund in the chat, and I just would like to say that I was fortunate enough to go with Fahima to Afghanistan a few years ago. And so I saw some of my, and myself, some of the wonderful work that she is doing for the people there. And all of that money goes to the projects. And there's no overhead. None of it is skimmed off. So if you feel like you would like to donate, I personally would recommend it as a wonderful charity, and appreciate all that Fahima has done there, and everything about her. And also, this has been such a pleasure to get to meet Matt, whom I have admired for years from afar. So that's one of the nice things about being the executive director of Maryland Peace Action, that I get to meet wonderful people like this. Thank you so much for these highly informative presentations.
Can I say one thing?
Interesting. Yes.
We are building a school in an area where the mother of all bomb was dropped. This is the first girls' school in the area for 40 years. And we were the first organization, the only organization went there in 40 years. That area called Achin in 2017, when they dropped the mother of all bombs there. So we are building a school, and it's almost finished. we will we will open the school sometime by the end of July, but we still need some donations. If anybody can support us with that, really, we appreciate it very much.
And I
Thank
just,
you,
I
Fahima.
just bring up a point about why that's so important for those people there. Those people were punished because they were supporting the Taliban or ISIS or whatever, you know, the insurgency. The mother of all bombs is a above ground explosive device. It detonates above the ground. It's complete. The stated purpose of using it was to wipe out Taliban tunnels. A bomb like that does literally nothing to anything below surface. And if the U.S. military knows this, the U.S. politicians would have been informed of this. So that's a really good example of how the United States punishes people who don't go along with them, who support the enemy, right? Who support the insurgency, whatever, who aren't on our side, is we do things that we know will have no effect on the Taliban and their operations, but will completely wipe out the entire area. And I'm sure Fahima can describe in quite detail. Yeah.
I went to the area twice, yes.
Okay, well, again, thank you both so much. And thank you to all of you who have joined our webinar. And we hope that you will help us to fight against the US empire and the militarism that we have created from this country that is doing so much damage abroad. Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all.